Coming up on today's episode of the Salesman Podcast.
In the traditional setting, the men would go out on hunting parties, bring along the older boys, and they would bond. It'd be like one big men's group or brotherhood, and they would get the masculine support and energy, and the women would be back getting the feminine. And then when they came back together, there was this sense of polarity and longing, and so there was attraction.
Hello Sales Nation, I'm Will Barron, host of the Salesman Podcast, and welcome to today's episode. On today's show we have Owen Marcus. We're diving into masculine emotional intelligence. Emotional intelligence I think has been done to death by a lot of other podcasts and content creators. So I wanted to take this slight angle on it, and of course most of the audience are male, so there'll be massive impact to you guys from this episode, I'm sure. Lots of interesting points and topics and how all this relates to sales, confidence, charisma, authenticity, and all that good stuff. You can find out more about Owen Marcus over at owenmarcus.com. He's got a book out called Grow Up, A Man's Guide to Masculine Emotional Intelligence, available on Amazon. And with all that said, without further ado, let's jump into today's episode. Hey Owen, and welcome to the Salesman Podcast.
Thank you, Will.
You are more than welcome. On today's show, we're going to talk about masculine emotional intelligence. I'm going to ask you for a definition of what that is to build context around it in a second. But I wanted to have you on the show, and I wanted to dive into it. Even though most of our audience are male, I'm sure this is going to have useful applications for the women who are listening as well. And I feel that we're constantly bombarded by the media. We're overwhelmed of the fact that you can't be un-PC. Everything has to be, you don't want to upset anyone. And so I think a lot of perhaps what we're going to talk about gets missed from that perspective. And I've been in this situation before, and hopefully this will all tie together as we get into the conversation. But I've been in this situation, and I do it less now, but I still find myself doing it, of this weird salesperson for blokes stereotype of being the alpha, having your chest out, and being full of fake testosterone and not being authentic to yourself. And I think it's something that plagues the sales industry. And I think a lot of people are groomed into being that aggressive, over-assertive stereotype. And so I want to discuss how that fits into all of this as well. But to get us started, Owen, can you give us a bit of a definition of how you would describe the idea and the concept of masculine emotional intelligence?
It comes from the fact that, ever since we left the tribe, men have been around less and less, and then particularly 200 years ago with the Industrial Revolution and men going into the factory, they were home a lot less. So what's happened over the years is women have raised us. In doing that, they've done the best job that they could, but they modeled and taught us how to be emotional as a woman. And the impact of that is we've lost our connection with that masculine emotional intelligence. And when we lose that connection, we struggle with our emotionality, and we've grown to accept it as guys, and women have too, and we all get frustrated. And what I've seen over the years of working with men and the different capacities that we do that is that as they learn how to feel, connect, accept their emotions as a man, and particularly learn how to connect or communicate emotionally as a man, their relationships improve, their communication skills improve. And what happens is women actually enjoy us and appreciate us more, even though we might not be doing it as they would think that we should do it for a better connection. We are actually connecting deeper with them.
So I'm going to turn this on its head straight away with a slightly obviously leading question here, but I thought men were supposed to not feel, not connect, not communicate any feelings and emotions. They're supposed to turn into this tiny little ball and shove down into the backs of their mind and never think about it again. Obviously, clearly a leading question, but is this the wrong way of looking at things?
Well, that's the old macho way that we've all been brought up. But at the same time, with these women, we've been brought up to be really sensitive, and each consecutive generation gets a little more sensitive when we move out of the macho-ness. So as guys, we're sort of stuck in this too extreme or double bind. Either we're sensitive or macho, and often we just give up.
Other than growing up and spending more time with women, and perhaps, if we look further back, and you can tell me if I'm right or wrong here, would there be a split in where we're talking about tribes? Would there be a split where the young lads would go out with the men hunting and the women would perhaps stereotypically be at home looking after the kids and that kind of thing? Is that the difference, that we've had 100,000 years of doing that, and then, as you alluded to, then 200 years of it being turned around?
Exactly. In the traditional setting, the men would go out in hunting parties, bring along the older boys, and they were bond. It'd be like one big men's group or brotherhood, and they would get the masculine support and energy, and the women would be back getting the feminine. And then when they came back together, there was this sense of polarity and longing, and so there was attraction. But the way that we've been brought up, and often the way that we work, and often share the same job and same home and family, we lose that polarity, and with that, we often lose that attraction.
And is this just the way it is, or should there be a shift? God, because I've got some thoughts on this myself, but you will have probably the better rounded answer to that.
That's the way it's been. It doesn't need to be that way. And what we're seeing with these guys that are in these free groups that we start is that when you put a group of guys together with a protocol that allows them to be consistent and safe, they will start teaching each other these skills. It's like buried in our genome, which is 99.9% the same genome we had back in the tribe, is this instinct of how to be emotional as a man. And so that's really what we want to do, but we've never had an environment that fostered it or any kind of modeling or teaching to be able to do that.
All right, so we'll come on to the protocol, and hopefully we'll get some real practical steps that both I and the audience can take from the show a little bit later on. But how does this relate to growing up and becoming a quote-unquote man as well? Because I can't remember the book. I could see the bookshelf in front of me, but I won't go over to it. And the way that book described growing up and becoming a man was, you are a man essentially when you no longer are needy of either of your parents. When you come to terms that they are just people like you, and you can, you don't have to please them, and you're separate from them from that perspective. How does your emotional intelligence tie in with all that and the process of growing up? Are you saying if people and the men listening who aren't emotionally intelligent and aren't engaged with the masculinity, they just are still essentially kids, even though they could be 30, 40 or whatever?
Yeah, that's possible. And that book I wrote, the Grow Up, A Masculine Guide to Masculine Emotional Intelligence, I laid out 9 steps or progressions that we go through if the environment fosters it or even allows for it. But what's happened is at different stages in our maturation, be it because of stress, trauma, or because it wasn't there, we didn't get that appropriate training or education. So one of the stages is this stage of leaving home. And, often back up in traditional societies, they had a whole ceremonies where the boys and the girls would go through this like vision quest. They had to be set out on their own, and they come back not as an adolescent or a child, but as an adult, and they would sit with the adults after that. So there was a whole ceremony set up to mark this transition. And here we really don't have it. And so what happens with men is that often they don't really feel like they've ever left home. And that does, you're right, thwart our development.
Yeah, and I see this in myself. I see this in, people of my generation, the millennials especially here in the UK, pretty much, and this is a generalization, but most people to some extent go to university or college after their high school and sixth form education. So that's another 3 or 4 years. Then most people move back in with their parents. And then, you get your first job, which is generally a lower grade job perhaps, and then you're working your way up. But I've got friends, and so I'm 29, they're 26, 27, and they're still living at home. And I know for one, my dad, it's something that winds him up tremendously, because he was of the generation of, he got an apprenticeship at 16, and he was one of the breadwinners of the house. He moved out when he was 18, and he was still paying to help towards the upkeep of his brothers and sisters with my nan. And so it really winds him up. Is this something that's happened in a generation?
I think has happened over time, and part of it is that each consecutive generation wants to help their kids even more than they were helped. So it comes from this intent of I'm going to give my kids what I didn't have. There's I think she's a Swiss psychologist, Alice Miller, that talks about how what happens with parents is that they project onto the kids what they didn't get. So they sort of give or set the kid up indirectly to give back to them what they didn't get. And that plays into these parents just giving all this material stuff, which is sort of indirectly their love that they didn't get. And it really ends up being a burden where, like with your father, he learned grit. He learned to get his ass out there and get to work, and not only for himself, but for his family. Yeah, it was tough, but he learned independence. And once you learn that, you always have it. So even if you fail, you know that you can do it again because you've done it once. And the longer you wait in doing that, the harder it is. And one of the ways that I've seen it for years are people that have been trust fund kids. And it's like they never left home because to really stand up for themselves, they often risk not receiving that trust fund, which is their survival. And with that, they've never really challenged authority, their parents, or take any risk where they ever had loss. Because one of the things that I think certainly makes a man is challenge and failing. Not always succeeding, failing from your challenge, be a sales call or a business or a relationship. And I didn't know this years ago, but I would say that for myself, the biggest successes in terms of growth came from my failures.
For sure. So what you're saying reminds me, and you may have read this, of a book called The Millionaire Next Door, where they set out the authors to suss out basically who are the millionaires in America, and they wanted to sell services to them. What they found, interestingly, was that the millionaires weren't the people with big flashy cars, were less likely to be the people who had trust funds, that kind of thing, and wealth was wiped out after a couple of generations from the process you just described of people not wanting to take risks, not wanting to grow up. They found that people who were given help towards their first house ended up in the longer term with a smaller house or a less expensive house because they were perhaps overstretching themselves on the interest and all that kind of thing. And I find all this really fascinating. So that leads me to the idea of success. Is there, and I don't know if there's any research, or I don't know how, I'm not 100% sure how it could be studied, but is there a link then between clearly taking more risk, having this masculine emotional intelligence, knowing yourself, being authentic, all these kind of things, and the successful men that we see in society, perhaps the super successful men that we see?
I really honestly don't know about particularly the super successful men. I mean, there's probably some kind of studies out there, but I think if we just sort of step back and sort of look at what is success, and I think economic success is certainly part of it. But what I see, with myself and other men is that, we often redefine success. When we redefine success in our own terms, we can start becoming more successful. So that's another part of growing up for men is not just to accept the terms of success that they were given. And, one of the stories I talked about in the book was years ago, I had a physician, he was a pediatric endocrinologist, and he was working with me. And one day he came in to see me, and he had a strange look on his face. And I said, "What's up?" And he told me, "I quit." I go, thought he was quitting working at me. And he goes, No, I'm quitting being a doc. I go, "What?" He says, "Yeah, I just realized, from working with you, I woke up the other day, looked in the mirror, and I go, this is not who I want to be. I'm a doctor because that's what my parents wanted me to do." And so he says, "I'm going to serve out my contract with the hospital, but I'm not going back to practicing medicine." And that takes a huge amount of courage to do that. I mean, talk about an investment. There's probably no greater investment than the practice of medicine in terms of work, time, money, and everything else. But he wasn't living his life. So yeah, he was successful, certainly by his parents' standards, but not by his own standards.
So that's a subject that we talk about quite often on the show, knowing what you want so you can work backwards from that process and get to it. And it's clearly something that's very difficult to do. So you mentioned towards the top of the show a protocol for sussing some of this out. Is there a step-by-step process to essentially growing up? Is it as something as definable and as perhaps simple to talk about, but potentially hard to do as that?
Yeah, that's what the book lays out. I mean, we lay out 9 steps. The first one is, learning how to be present. So as we're born, babies start pretty innocent, and we all know that. We don't really remember it from our own experience, but we've certainly seen babies. They seem happy and content, but for some reason we seem to lose that. So it's not getting back to that kind of bliss, but it's that kind of ability to have that connection or be in that state of peace or mindfulness or acceptance. And that's a skill set that we've all been sort of trained out of. So that's where we start. And then we go through processes of, extracting that man from the limiting connections of his childhood. And then we go through to, ending with the 9th phase or stage, is really learning how to enjoy our lives as men. Now, that said, a young man necessarily wouldn't, because of his age, have the opportunity to go through all the 9 stages. But the foundation is set with the first few stages. Once you have that, you have the foundation, you have the momentum, and the rest of it gets a lot easier, and your relationships get a lot easier, which is what brings people into working with us. Is often romantic relationships, but sometimes business relationships, because they can't seem to understand, because they have the skills or the knowledge, but they can't seem to be successful. And often what's happening is they haven't learned this ability to communicate with people in a way that is significant.
And this is what I'm slightly confused on, this ability to communicate with other people on a higher level, perhaps. How does this work? I can understand it perhaps from a man to a woman, and I'm avoiding any rabbit holes here of saying men are just all masculine, women are all feminine, or whatever. There's obviously gradients to all of this, I'm sure. So avoiding all that and just sticking to a man and a woman's conversation, I can see why a woman would be attracted to a man who's got all this nailed, because there's so many evolutionary traits that tag along to this, or Darwinian traits perhaps that tag along with this. But for a business conversation, how does becoming a man, knowing yourself, how does that translate to a better business relationship?
Well, I came up with a test called the MQ test, the masculine quotient test. And we have 5 skills. And one of the unique skills is what I call assertive vulnerability. So it's being able to be vulnerable, which, as we all know, develops empathy and rapport. But we need a backbone as a man. And so this assertive vulnerability addresses that. So it's staying open, but the ability to assert yourself, which might be to ask for the sale. So, all right, you get a great rapport going with your prospective customer. You're having a lot of fun, but you got to ask for the sale. And some guys have a hard time doing that. Or where often shows up is setting boundaries, or particularly, a boundary is set by saying no. And I've had successful businessmen that really struggled with saying no. And once they learned that through, or courses or groups, their business, as one guy I'm thinking of last year, tripled in 1 year, because he was able to assert himself for his customers. His customers always liked him, but he was being too nice. And as he learned to, stay nice or stay in rapport with these people, he also learned how to set boundaries and say no. Because before then, he was all stressed out. He was answering phone calls and texts 24/7. He didn't have a life, and it was draining him and draining his business. And now, not only does he have more business, but he has better customers.
Definitely. I can attest to this as well, working in the medical device world in sales before doing the show. For the first year, I would run around like a headless chicken doing absolutely everything for every surgeon. So this was, on a Saturday morning, hey, Will, I need this endoscope for this procedure at 11 o'clock. Can you drive an hour over and drop it off? And of course, I'd just do it thinking that this was the best way to build rapport. and they just saw me as a pushover very, very clearly. It was a sales manager that pointed this out, and just his words were "man up," probably the Neanderthal version of the conversation that we're having. And I did. I became more assertive from that, and then I saw the results from it. And so this interests me. How then? Because I see an assertive male who's good at building rapport, who has genuine self-confidence. They know their authentic self. Everything that we're talking about, they know where they want to go in life. They're on that journey through it, and perhaps they can take you along with them to a certain extent. I see that as, I would recharacterize that as just a really charismatic person. Does this all just tie in with charisma as well?
I think it does, because both women and men want a guy that's open, not closed down, not the hard macho, but they also want a guy that sort of walks into the space and to use another vernacular, holds that space. So they walk in and they're not dominating the space, but they're open, and everyone starts to relax, because we feel this, if not consciously, unconsciously. When someone comes in the room, the first thing is either we're going to be repelled or attracted to the person. And then if we're attracted, we're attracted in the sense of, oh, I feel relaxed. I want to meet this person. I want to have an interaction. I want to listen to him. And that's a skill that a few people just seem to have to start off. But most of us have to work at that. But it is a skill that can be learned. And we've had men that were really shy, and they were sensitive, maybe smart, but they had a very hard time building rapport. And through working with us, really, the men in these groups, they had an opportunity to practice these skill sets. And then once they get to a certain level from just doing it every week, they just started noticing that, in their businesses and in their romantic lives, that, people were more attracted to them, and it was less work. It was something that was natural for them.
For sure. And you touched on something then, and I want to wrap up this part of the show with this idea or concept. How much of all of this, and because we talked about charisma on the show before, and it seems that at first you have to do it consciously, and then it becomes an unconscious process. How much of everything we talked about is, in the same respect, a conscious activity, process, 9 steps that you're thinking about and undertaking, versus how much of it is subtle and unconscious that just happens over time and you I guess build into your personality?
I think both. It's like learning a sport. So when you go learn the sport, you chunk it down, you learn the skills. And you're not often learning the skills as you do the sport. I mean, if say it's basketball, you practice the 3-pointer, you're practicing the skills to the point where you become unconscious competent. You have this ability where you're just able to do it. You don't need to think about it. But in the beginning, you got to think about it. So there's a didactical part where you learn the theories, and then this is the most of it, where you just go out and practice. And particularly in these groups, you get feedback from other guys who are practicing. Feedback, at all different levels, like real-time feedback. So if you're being a jerk, the other guys are going to tell you you're being a jerk. Or more likely, you're describing something, and everyone can feel and see that you're emotional. Your eyes might be watering, your hand might be shaking, and you're squirming. And someone says, "Hey, John, what are you feeling?" "Oh, I'm not feeling anything." And everyone goes, "I don't think that's the case." And then we might ask, "Okay, what's your hand doing?" And we get the guy aware of his body. And as he's aware of his body, and then he starts to become aware of his emotions. So these are skills that we can learn. And once we learn them, just like learning how to ride a bike, it becomes unconscious, and it's a skill set that we never forget. We just keep honing.
Amazing stuff. Okay, Owen, one final question to wrap up this part of the show. What is the best way? What's the biggest bang for buck, the biggest takeaway, the most practical thing that men and I listening to this show now can put the show down, they can stop because they're likely running on a treadmill or driving in the car to a sales meeting at the moment, listening to this. What's the one thing they can do to get a head start of all of this, other than buy the book, which we'll come on to at the end of the show? Is it as you alluded to then, do they need to ask their friends these kind of questions, get together to have a discussion about it? Should they be videoing themselves and their interactions, or is there a hack or a process to get around some of this?
All that would work, but I think even simpler, we have a huge like microwave dish, and that's our body. It's a great perceiver of experience. So as we become more aware of our own body's response, we learn a lot about what we're feeling and you might say thinking, but what our emotions are having. So the first thing would be just sort of slow down, breathe, and feel what your body does when you're in an interaction with someone, say like a sales call. And so what that does is it one opens you up to your own emotional awareness intelligence. It's sort of a backdoor into that. And the other benefit is you'll probably relax. And I guarantee the more relaxed you are, the more relaxed the other person's going to be, which if it's a sales call, the more likely they are, as you know, to be open up to what you're selling. And then thirdly, from that relaxation and then being open, you can start developing a rapport in that moment, and you're responding not from your head. It's like you've forgotten your script, but you're responding spontaneously, which is what people want. That's what charisma is. No one that has charisma has a script. They're just winging it, and they're interacting. And the thing is, if they screw up, they're so in the moment that they sense that they screwed up, and they get back to that rapport. And in that quote screw up, the other person feels comfortable because they go, oh, that guy just screwed up and it wasn't a big deal. So it's okay if I do. He's a human. He's humble. I'm more relaxing and more trusting because really, if I'm going to buy something from you, I have to trust you. And one of the things that I'm not so much cognitively thinking about, but what I'm evaluating is, do you trust your own experience? Do you trust what you're feeling, and are you willing to express it? And the more that you're willing to do that, the more I'm going to be able to trust you and consequently, invest in whatever you want me to invest in.
Amazing. Owen, you said that in a far more eloquent way than most of the sales trainers that we have on the show that try and describe the same phenomenon. Because you're spot on, and all the best sales conversations I've ever had have come from that point of, you are in the moment, you are just there to have that conversation, you're not trying to sell, you're letting it just happen and develop. And then, of course, perhaps you need to be assertive at the end of the conversation to make sure that there's some action that takes place. So you're not just having a friendly conversation, things are being moved forward, which again, it adds value to the conversation, is useful, especially if the other person is perhaps less assertive and is happier to sit back, but know they need to take action. And so I really appreciate that. And I've got one final question for you. This is something to ask everyone that comes on the show. And I know you're not an out-and-out sales professional, but you've talked about trust. You've talked about a whole bunch of things that we talk about regularly on the show. So you'll have an insight to this, I'm sure. But if you could go back in time and speak to your younger self, what would be the one piece of advice you'd give him to help him become better at selling?
Screw up more, take more risks, and just speak and take the long view. I was really focused in the beginning on getting it right and perfecting it in the moment, where now I would say, be willing to make mistakes, because in the long run, I'm going to learn more and my skills are going to be better. And in terms of sales, I'm going to be more successful, and I'm going to have the customers that I really like.
Love it. Absolutely love it. Owen, tell us a little bit about the book, and then share a little bit about the new course you've got coming out.
The book is actually right here. Grow Up, a Man's Guide to Masculine Emotional Intelligence. It came out a couple years ago, and every week or so I get some guy from around the world writing me an email thanking me and how it changed their life. It's a really simple approach to filling in those gaps that we didn't get filled in when we grew up. And by filling them in, we were able to grow up. My work started out with working with men's groups, free men's groups, and now we go around really the world teaching guys these skills and helping them set up their groups. And then I had such an interest in that, and guys that couldn't do that, they wanted more. So I developed an online course called Emotional Superman, and it's at emotionalsuperman.com. and we're getting ready to release our next iteration, the next version of that. And it's, of course, taking men, not through the book necessarily, but some of those things and other skill sets, and through the course and through the group interaction, really giving men the opportunity to learn and reframe, what was limiting into a way that it's really supportive for themselves. And the feedback has been excellent. And I'm even surprised. I was just hesitant. Can we really teach this stuff online? Because we're talking about some of these, quote, soft skills, but we really can. And a lot of that was through the interaction that we did as a group.
Fantastic stuff. Well, with that, Owen, we will link to both of them in the show notes. We will, of course, share the course when it's out there. And with that, I want to thank you for your time and thank you for joining us on the Salesman Podcast.
Thank you, Bill. It's been my pleasure.
And there we have it. Thank you, Owen, for joining me on the show. I appreciate your time. Thank you, Sales Nation, as always, for your attention and all the sharing and everything you do at the moment. The show's going through some massive growth, and it's nothing to do with me. It's down to you guys spreading the word, so I appreciate that. And with all that said, without further ado, I'll speak with you all again tomorrow.